Emisión.net.
Hello again and welcome to Letter from England, broadcasting for AC Press and the Spanish Evangelical Alliance. One of the pillars of Catholicism, auricular or audible confession to a priest, is crumbling. 80% of those who still claim to be Catholics in Spain no longer bother, despite the fact that the second commandment of the Catholic Church requires its members, quote, to confess their mortal sins at least once a year. However, while the confessional box is emptied, the psychiatrist's surgery has filled, and people are consulting all kinds of alternative so-called spiritual therapies as well. So serious is the situation that the Pope recently told priests, never resign yourselves to seeing the confessional box empty. Concrete figures in Spain are not easy to come by, possibly because the Catholic Church itself does not want to admit that the sacrament of penitence has all but disappeared. Some Catholic magazines are less secretive, though, and Misión Abierta carried out a survey which, even way back in 1989, already registered a mere 23% adult attendance at confession and a paltry 15% among the youth. At the time, the bishops recognized that they should not hide the crisis away, but confront it. Since then, however, the situation has got even worse, and also perhaps the determination to do something about it has declined. The figure for adult confessions has fallen to 15%, while fewer than 5% of Catholic youngsters spill the beans to a priest. And here we're talking about committed Catholics. Among the more nominal, 80% never go to confession at all. Gianfranco Girotti, a kind of head confessor, i.e. confession defender at the Vatican, says, people come to church without confessing, while those who do go to confession don't seem to have anything to confess. There's no consciousness of sin. The Ten Commandments still exist, but most Catholics happily break several of them, while the notorious 7 deadly sins are no longer seen as vices, but even at times as virtues. So, things like pride, lust, anger, envy and the rest are just slightly naughty these days, while a new list of deadly sins has replaced them in the minds of many. Genocide, terrorism, arms or drug trafficking, corruption, tax evasion or environmental crime. In other words, sins that people themselves don't think that they commit. What few people realize, of course, is that in Catholic dogma there are some sins which, even though confessed, cannot be forgiven by a mere priest or even by a bishop. This privilege is reserved for the Pope. And there's quite an astonishing list. There are 5 specific sins which Rome claims only the pontiff may forgive. The theft of a consecrated wafer for use in satanic rituals surely can't be committed that often. The revealing of a confessional secret, pederasty, abortion, and attacking or offending the Pope. One wonders what 5 sins evangelical ministers would choose if they had the power to forgive them. Well, apparently the Vatican department charged with dealing with Catholics who commit these sins struggles to keep up with the workload, as there are so many cases. As Cardinal Rocco put it, in Madrid there's a huge amount of sinning. Well, quite. Yet there are almost as many excuses or reasons for not going to confession. What a tragedy then that the Catholic Church doesn't understand the Bible's teaching on forgiveness, that it's directly between God and the individual who seeks it, on the basis of the work of Jesus on the cross. Jesus is the intermediary, not the priest. In Medina Celi Basilica, one of the most important Catholic churches in Madrid, there is always at least one priest confessor on duty. But there's less and less work. And the typical profile of the person who does go to confession is that of a woman aged over 60. Well, why have many Catholics fled the confessional? Some say because of priests who emphasize the fear and punishment of God, who saw sin on all sides, and who generally generated a sensation of guilt among the faithful. Others believe that it's a way the Church keeps control of people, and people want their freedom. And all this despite changes at Vatican II, which led to priests changing their questions. So no longer were they encouraged to ask how often and with whom, but perhaps to take a slightly more softly approach. Even sometimes priests have ditched their traditional confessional boxes for more comfortable surroundings. Yet the so-called Catholic TARDIS was not always thus, and swapping it for the counsellor's couch not entirely new. Individual heard confession in a secret box and while kneeling was only actually brought in during the 12th century and given specific regulations at the Council of Trent in the 16th. In fact, Spanish Catholic bishops back in the 6th century condemned what they called the appalling practice of private confession. And what's more frequent, confession in this way only became widespread in the 20th century. So the other day in Santa Barbara Church in Toledo, for example, there was just one woman confessing her sins in one of the church's 2 confessionals. There were 12 people at the Mass, 11 of whom received the wafer. On her way out, Pilar, 54, said, "At our age we haven't got any sins. We don't need to go to confession very often." While one of her friends added, "Most people forget about God and only come here when things get tight." How long, I wonder, before a confessional box turns up on eBay? Thank you for listening to Letter from England, broadcasting at the AC Press and emission.net. Goodbye.
Emisión.net